Any organization, any human individual, any human system, it's not a linear growth journey. It's a journey of cyclical growth and decay. Birth, growth, death, decay, and rebirth. So even though we will one day retire and die, we will probably be leaving marks on people's lives and in next generations of lives that we will never know and understand. And that can pull us back from some of the dismay we may feel at the news cycle or the ups and downs of our businesses or the falling apart of relationships. There is everywhere around us renewal happening. All right, we're here on the Beyond Listening podcast, and it's me, Adam, and Adam Rumack, and Miriam Jones.
Me, Miriam Jones.
And we're taking a little break from our guests here, and we're going to start doing this a little bit more often to give you some maybe things to think about and some tangible tools that you can work with when you're in your leadership roles, or even as a member of a team when you're thinking about function and dysfunction, efficiency and ineffectiveness, and the spectrum that we find ourselves in on teams or in leadership all the time. If you still think that there's going to be a perfect stasis that you're going to find as a leader or a member of a team, or you're going to get the perfect job where there's never any problems and you exist on the highest ideal of that spectrum, then you're probably listening to the wrong podcast.
Whoa, you're like destroying all my fantasies of like the perfect workplace will come.
That's what we do here at We Are Open Circle. We destroy fantasies.
Great.
Because we really want to. There's a truth to that. There's something in the journey of bringing our work into the world, doing our work, and by that I mean humans, bridging that gap between our inspiration and what we can create on the large or even this very small local scale. There's a magic to the difficulties and the challenges of it. So that's where we actually find energy in how do we solve the next problem, and what did we learn from that? And that's what it means to be alive, I think.
Yeah, well, how do we solve it, or how do we let it move us in another direction?
Yeah, change us, shape us. So we're going to talk about trust today, and we're talking about trust. We are not experts on trust, but we've definitely been grappling with the questions around trust and brought into organizations and onto teams to help build trust, or where trust was sort of at the center of the identified issue. We don't trust each other enough, or the team doesn't trust leadership, or et cetera, et cetera. So back in the day, early mentor of mine, I was a young leader in an old organization, and I brought this question to her around trust. And I said, it's amazing how we spend in this organization. There was a lot of sort of social, emotional connection and interpersonal connection, that there was a lot of talk about. It feels like a family, for better or worse. So there was a lot of the trust. On some level, there was a lot of trust. We knew each other very well. But on other levels, we didn't trust each other at all. And she kind of broke it down to me, and she said, well, in any relationship, there's really three kinds of trust. The first is integrity, right? So we are who we say we are. We're not living a fiction. We're not pretending to be someone we're not. The second is capability. So that we need to trust that the person that we're working with or relating with is capable of doing the things that they say they can do. So, obvious example, we hire people in an organization that because of a resume, we need to make sure that resume actually results in them being able to do the skill set that they say they're going to be able to do. The third is that we will do what we say we're going to do. So follow through, right? So even if we have the greatest most developed skill set to be able to perform the things that we say we can perform. We still have to have the discipline, the commitment, the discipline and the commitment to be able to follow through. So on any team, there's these three layers of trust. There's the trust that people on the team are who they say they are, that they're being honest, that they can do what they say they can do, and that they will follow through on that. They'll follow through on their commitments to do the things that they say they're going to do. And that really works when it comes to teams. There's also some other aspects of trust that we've identified in working with teams over time. And these kind of fall into, these are harder to pin down and also harder to address. We're going to come back to that later. But Miriam, you want to give some examples on how we, when you've experienced one or multiple layers of failure when it comes to those different levels of trust, and or how you've been able to kind of build, how the work that you do or we do has been able to strengthen an aspect of that.
I was going to say, you asking me to reveal my dirty laundry.
No.
The one that I've seen a lot of is integrity. We are who we say we are, and I've seen that with leadership, and also particularly in organizations. So we've done a lot of work in values work, or in organizational identity. And one of the big pitfalls in that work, and also when leaders are leading a transformation, is that when an organization or when a leader says an organization is about something, but then doesn't act in that way. So, I was having a conversation yesterday with the head of DEI at a big accounting firm, and she was talking about authenticity. So the workplace very much was committed to inclusivity and said, bring your authentic self to work. And as she listened and observed in the workplace, what she observed and saw was that authenticity meant a certain thing. It was defined in a certain way by the majority of people in the organization. There were unspoken rules. And so the statement, bring your authentic self to work, didn't clearly communicate to the people what that meant. So we are who we say we are. What we see is that broad terms are used, but then the way that they are understood is through behavior. So authenticity is defined by the way that people, the group, the team, the organization, act in authenticity. So authenticity is acting in a particular way. And so that means that people in the organization lose trust in the organization's capacity to really let them be themselves and for that to be safe. And this is where issues of psychological safety come up. So it's just a small example of the integrity, which is not, really importantly, trust is not something that that is like a skill, a technical skill to be learned. It's a practice. It moves and changes. So in the practice of integrity, we are who we say we are. It's this continual kind of reshaping and moving with actually investigating and talking about what that means. In this example, what does it mean to be our authentic self, to bring our authentic selves to work? What does that mean when I'm in a meeting, or what does that mean when I'm here in my performance review? What is being asked of me in that? And so that's that kind of investigation and practice of integrity in relationship to trust.
Yeah, I think about it like integrity is like being able to draw a direct line between what we say and what we do. And the more grandiose, and in some sense it's just vague, the words are, the easier it is to have those lines be disconnected. So I think about an example that comes up for me when it comes to integrity, and think about it in the collective terms, because I think those three layers of trust really, they're easier to pin down when it comes to an individual. Like an individual leader can be more clear about their own skills and pitfalls as a leader. It's harder to pin down when it comes to a group. But when it comes to the value statements, that's where where it becomes really important. So I remember around the same time that this mentor gave me the three layers of trust, inclusivity was a big topic, and even the phrase radical inclusivity was really up. Like, how can we be just radically inclusive? And my mind still hasn't changed on this, that but I'm open to it changing. At that time, I really felt like every organization is an act of exclusion. When you bring someone, when you hire someone, you're excluding all the people that you didn't hire. There's a cultural exclusion that happens, right? So if our organization is focused on educating engineers, we are excluding by necessity, we have to exclude a whole bunch of educational material in order to prepare those engineers. If our organization is about landscaping, well, why would we include someone who doesn't have any background in landscaping, for example? So, I mean, I'm being a little bit like oversimplistic here, but in this organization where radical inclusivity was the sort of mandate that people were striving for, it seemed like they were talking about race, gender, and maybe age, biological age. But that was never spoken about explicitly. So my question was always, well, who are we willing to exclude? Right? And it was clear to me anyways that implicitly who could be excluded were people who had strong political beliefs that were strongly at odds with the mission of this organization. So, for example, we were working on social emotional learning in schools and in prisons, and if someone that was very sort of democratic, or U.S. in terms of U.S. politics, Democratic Party, liberal leaning. And there was a lot of talk very often about our neighbors who had the shooting range in their backyard and who owned guns. And when the time that Trump came onto the scene for the presidential election, there was, they had the Trump signs up, and there was an implicit exclusion of those folks. I never heard anyone reach out to them and try to build a relationship with them, even though they were neighbors to the center that we were running. So is that wrong? I'm not necessarily saying that that's wrong for this organization, or was wrong for this organization. But in terms of radical inclusivity as that big ideal, it didn't match up. So there was a lack of integrity that made it easy. It was easy to see it for some of us, and very hard to bring it up, because it placed us on the side in that kind of black and white thinking of, well, are you that person too? Right? So culturally, it was invisible to most people in the organization, as most aspects of culture are. So cultural blind spots, collective lack of integrity, and it would have been easily, I think, addressed by saying, well, we want to be inclusive to these people, and why not just say, but we're not actually going to be inclusive to these people. Like, we are willing to stand up against or without the inclusion of those folks. But that's a hard conversation to have. And that's why most organizations are not going to have that conversation.
Yeah, and the other thing that came up as you were talking was be transparent about your limitations, as well as a leader, as what are your boundaries? Where are the boundaries? And that kind of goes into the next one, which is capability. Capable of doing the things we say we can do. And I've been thinking of, I mean, there's the obvious thing in this of being really clear when you have aspirational goals, which isn't so much of, which is about this is what we're aiming for. But the big example that comes up is working with a team which was not, which had very tactical meetings, an executive team that over a period of time as we worked with them, we could see that when they gathered, they were very tactical meetings, but there wasn't a lot of sharing of information. So tactical towards the strategy of the organization, but there wasn't a lot of sharing of information about each of their departments and the capacity of each of their departments, or understanding. There wasn't a lot of room for understanding how things were getting done. And I think that's a lot of the time, that's where trust in those sort of situations gets lost, because when the leader when there isn't space for that, and it's headlines, and as a group it's headlines, and particularly when there's high growth goals and there's a lot of pressure to get things done, and each of those things amongst the different departments relies on each other in order for the organization as a whole to meet their goals. When there isn't room for an exploration of capacity, like how, this is how I'm thinking that we could get this done, in the communication of the team, there's not a lot of room to kind of see what might happen cross-functionally, how that might work. I think that's often where trust is lost, because when they came back together, when we observed them coming back together, and certain people had not reached those goals and other people had, it became a competitive environment where the people who had reached them were like, yes, you've done really well. And the people who hadn't, it was like, you failed, you must be doing something wrong. And it kind of missed the point of investigating perhaps the wider context of why that had happened. Was it more difficult for the marketing department? What were those difficulties? Were they influenced by other things in the organization? And it stopped the team learning and growing together. So an example of that, of building trust in that team, wasn't about let's go out to lunch and all talk about our lives, although that did happen a little bit at the beginning so that they could know who each other were. In this example, at this particular time, it was actually sharing more about what they were doing in their roles, in what was happening functionally, in where the problems were, not from I'm making an excuse or blaming someone else, but actually to learn from each other. So again, putting learning at the center. And in that way, not only was more trust built because there was more understanding of the capacity and where that was limited and why, but also it allowed the trust in the team to reach what they all needed for the organizational goals to build, because they started working cross-functionally in that team, and could trust, or because of that understanding, could trust more about what the levers were that they needed to pull cross-functionally in order all to move forward. So that's one of the examples I thought of in relationship to capability.
Yeah, so I'm seeing, I don't think about this very often, but I'm seeing that, it's really hard to trust, to have the conversations about capability on a team if that integrity is not there. And how's the trust around integrity built? It's by actually getting underneath the facade that we all put up, the masks that we all put up when we're in a social environment where we don't know people as well. So we start to break that down. So get people to, rather than just the facade of I'm a great leader, or I'm a great team member, or whatever, which is a limiting story, to give people the opportunity to be able to hear each other and understand, oh, well, this person's got a really rich, we all have a rich story that led us to wherever we are now, and we're continuing to write that story with our lives. And then we can start to be a little bit more honest about our capabilities, right? Like the resume is one page. Does that really show us when we're looking at the makeup of a team what people are really capable of? Well, I might be able to do a pretty in-depth spreadsheet, but it'll take me with calculations and all those things. Like, I'm sure there's better words for it, but it's been a long time since I did one because I'm not that good at them, and it'd take me a week to do that. But if we have someone on our so I can, but if I know that there's someone on the team who just loves that, they get energy from that. In fact, I just did there's a nonprofit board that that I co-chair, and there's a fundraising part of this. And before we jumped into tactics, before we jumped into there's some slogans out there that you kind of repeat to a fundraising committee to try to make everyone comfortable with fundraising. Before we did any of that, the question that I asked the group was, what gives you energy and what takes away your energy when it comes to fundraising? And the web, like everybody in this organization kind of does everything. So there's an event, everybody shows up to it, right? Does that mean everyone loves it? No, of course not. So some people, we found out in this round, hated the events. Like they were just petrified to be there, and it was a ton of work. And some other people love the events, and they love all the logistics of putting it together, and they actually loved getting up and other people loved getting up and talking to people about what the organization does. And it was clear to me that they'd never had that conversation. They were just thinking tactically. So what I was able to do just sitting there on the back of my notebook was, okay, this person gets energy from this. This person hates doing this. And I'm going to be thinking, as I'm helping to organize our fundraising activities for the year, okay, put this person on event planning, get this person up in front of people, have this person do all the follow-up in the office because they don't want to be at the event at all, and they can come and just be in the background. So I think that's another way of thinking about capabilities, but we couldn't have that conversation if people were pretending that they loved everything or pretending that they were good at everything. So start with integrity, then go to capability. And then, of course, we need to know, and this is something in this example that I don't know, is how much people are going to follow through. So is the person who loves the events, do they actually have the time? Are they being honest about their capacity in terms of time and how their time during the weeks is being distributed? Do they have the focus and the discipline to follow through on things when we inevitably hit some rough patches, right? Are they going to do the follow-up call when it comes to a big ask, even though it gives them energy to have those conversations? We don't know that yet. So that's that layer of trust. If we have those other two foundations, integrity, we trust who we say we are. We trust that we have the capabilities on the team and we know who has them. That's built through time, right? Like we jump in the ring with someone and do some work together, and we see, well, this person shows up really strong one day a week and then they're gone for the rest of the week and we don't know what they're doing, or is that a communication thing, or are they just incapable of following through because of whatever is going on? If we have that level of integrity, trust at the beginning, and we have the capability, then we can have that conversation, right? And we can start to understand why a person is following through, and if they're not, if the limitations in that are big enough, maybe they're not the right person for the team, or we need to be moved to something else where there's less of a focus required, or where the stakes are a little bit lower.
It's interesting, the last one. I kind of have a personal relationship with the last one. We will do what we say we will do. When I was young, my family called me flaky. In other words, they said that I would say things. I called myself idealistic, but they said that was flaky, and I took that on and as something to work on. And so I've noticed in my work life, I've been very focused on, if I say I'm going to do something, I do it. And it doesn't matter if I have to stay up to 10 o'clock or whatever the circumstances, I will, for almost, 95% of the time, I will follow through. Now that has an Achilles heel to it in our body of work, because what that also means is that my overcommitment to that, it has an effect on my capability. I'm not always, when I do those things, capable of doing them well. I just do them. It also stops me responding to the environment when it's changed. So I guess I want to say this one, we will do what we say we will do, isn't linear. What I think underneath that is about transparent communication. It's not putting a blindfold on and saying, yes, I'm going to do this regardless because I said I would get you this by 9:30 a.m. and even though I don't think it's the right thing to do and there are all these other things going on, I'm going to do it. What it means is that if you have said something, remembering what you've said and kind of adjusting it, communicating about the adjustment. This is something we've particularly seen come up in remote working. So, those kind of tiny adjustments happen all the time when we're in the same workplace. We can see what someone's doing. Oh, they're stressed, they're working on that. Okay, and the adjustments tend to happen. With remote working, where we don't have that vicarious knowledge or line of sight, it becomes more and more important to give people that line of sight. And of course, that's connected with those conversations, as Adam said, about capability, about understanding how you're working, the way that you're working, what your adjustments are, what you're learning about. I'll give you a really good example with me and Adam. Again, another work example for us. So for a long time, Adam, when he gets focused on a task, he's focused. Whereas when I'm doing a task, I'll often be doing 10 things at once. It means that Adam's work is a lot more high quality than mine. I'm often, doing a bad first draft. And because of that,
but you can't interrupt me. I'm just gonna do
and because of that, I would often pick up messages on Slack for Adam because I just, from his behavior, I was like, he's not going to check Slack. And this week on Monday, Adam said to me, hey, listen, you don't need to remind me about what's on Slack anymore. I'm checking it. I don't think you said when you were checking it, but you said I'm
I
basically
check it
checking
when I'm
it.
done with what I'm working on.
You check it when
Then I
you're
go
done.
for the
You
next
check.
thing.
I'm checking it. I'm checking it a few times a day, and so that was that was important because I didn't trust that he was checking it. I was over communicating. I was like, great, now we can adjust. So for me, this one is about communicating how we're working. So this is how I'm working at the moment. This is how I'm setting goals. And as again, it happens over time as you get to know each other's working, the ways that each other work, but it's also talking about when you're adjusting things. I'm working on this at the moment. I'm working on adjusting these. And again, it's that idea that sort of communication about how we're working allows us to build trust and also move together as we learn and adjust.
Yeah, one thing, I think it's a generational thing too. Without any scientific, I can't put a study in the notes here, but I've noticed that kind of age groups that we're working with under 30 have really good boundaries when it comes to work. So I'm kind of in the middle, like early, I guess, early millennial, very early millennial cusp there, where I was kind of raised to be similar to you, Miriam, in terms of like, I'm just going to say yes to everything. Like that's what you do. And I grew up working in my idea of work was kind of cultivated in, get there really early, stay until the job is done. I think my story has been told on here, but as working for my dad as a small business owner, that mentality of you're responsible for everything. It doesn't, that I think it was Jocko that popularized extreme ownership. Well, in our case, it was really extreme ownership. Truthfully, my dad owned the store and it was a family business. So there were family stakes and there were, there was the ownership. And so whatever people are doing, you can get them to do the job better or you can hire the right people. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to you. And that was sort of how I was trained. So and I would see my dad leave at 4 in the morning and come back at 7 or 8 at night sometimes, right? Or be there for multiple days when there was some, big events that were happening that he needed to be at that store. So, but I've seen as we've brought on younger folks now, kind of like, again, that under 30 or right around 30-year-old age, it's like, I can't do that task this week because I have all of this other stuff on my plate. And at first I was like, that's, what are you saying? I didn't express that, but then I started to really respect that, because the conversation about priorities is not one that I ever learned how to have really well. It was like, okay, you give me 10 things to do. Well, I just got to get them all done. And that's kind of how I did my thing, and probably, missed out on a lot of opportunities to do things better. And it was always about me. My dad always trained me to be more efficient. He used to say, never walk down the aisle of his grocery store with only one thing on your cart, or never with an empty cart. Like if your cart is not full, you should be filling it with things that need to come off the floor of the grocery store, or it should be prepared to fill, and never be traveling around. Like always be efficient. It was never like, okay, focus on one thing and prioritize and make a list of priorities for the day and do all those things. That, I think that's a great work ethic. But at the same time, I can also respect the other side of that. So that conversation, again, it depends on that integrity. So, and psychological safety that comes out of that is cultivated alongside that. You got to have the skill first, and then you got to be able to have the conversation based on the trust that's there to say, hey, you know what? I don't think I can actually do that this week in the way that you need me to, or in the way that the team might need me to. Is there anyone else that can back me up? That would be a really hard thing for me to say 10 years ago when I was kind of starting in leadership roles. So I want to kind of move us to the other aspects of trust that are a little squishier. Are we ready for that, Miriam? You want to add anything?
Well, can I just add one thing? I'm just want to say, just in summary, and you might want to check out the podcast we did with Wendy Fraser here on trust repair. I just want to say the big myth that happens when these forms of trust is that trust is often seen as interpersonal trust. And I just want to say, I hope you're getting the big message here that in this breakdown is also understanding like that there are these components which might be lumped together as interpersonal trust. Like, I don't trust that person. But really, by breaking this down and breaking it down about people and about organizations, it starts to really help you not get to the situation where trust repair is necessary, where you can continue to adjust with these different and discern with these different capacities.
Yeah. We're not talking about truth and reconciliation here when we're talking about these layers of trust, right? We're talking about the sort of day-to-day responsibility to attend to these layers of trust within a relatively healthy and functioning organization. Not one that's kind of outside of the realm of what we're talking about here when it comes to, okay, trust has been severely broken, and it needs to be, before anything else can happen, trust needs to be repaired. So both of those things I think are a good segue to the other two layers of trust. And again, they're squishy because the time it takes to erode trust in these two, particularly the first one I'm going to mention, it's not great. It can happen very quickly. And it's very hard to rebuild it. So systemic trust. Do we trust the systems? Do we and what this is going to look like is, I'll give an example, a multi-geographical organization what we're working with, had hubs, self-organizing hubs within different parts of the United States and around in Europe and in Australia. And because they had grown so quickly within the span of a decade, and because they were self-organizing in principle, there was a significant lack of trust within the localities for the overall system that the central organization was operating with. So while the people, because they spent time together in their geographical communities and had very little time with central leadership, they had no way of building trust. They trusted that the people were good that were running it, but so in other words, they trusted the integrity to some extent. But what they didn't trust was that the systems in place were actually supporting them. So this was a faith-based men's organization, and do I need to go into that? I don't think so. No. So
I can give another example too when you're done.
So it wasn't just that they disagreed with policies that were being created or with strategies for growth or for fundraising or for curriculum that were being created centrally. It was that they didn't trust that the systems being put in place were of the highest service to the people that they were serving on the ground. And every tactic that the central organization was attempting to use to create that trust ignored the fundamental, saw the problem as a tactical or technical problem to be solved, not as a trust issue. So when we came into this organization, we saw the questions they were asking were, should we use this management tool? Like, how can we communicate better? Well, what are you trying to communicate? What's really needed there was our question. And what it came down to in our investigation was, hey, they don't have any relationship with you. They don't understand the localities maybe they don't need the tools that you're even implementing. What they need is to actually trust that you're looking out for them and that you have their best needs and interest, their needs and interests in mind when you're making decisions. So systemic trust. Miriam, what do you want to add to that?
I'm going to go back to the example of the accounting firm I used earlier because I think it's another good one, and it builds on what you were saying, Adam, with the tactical. And I think this is often when a system is acting tactically, but not at the same time. And this is why you're calling it squishy, working on with the squishy stuff, the harder stuff. So in this example, with the focus on DEI, hiring for diversity. And so ticking the box of like, okay, we want to increase the diversity, particularly in terms of cultural origin, color of skin. And so they're going to tick the box in terms of, yes, that person is from a different culture or origin than the majority here. And yes, we've done that. And what the head of DEI started to notice was that while they were hiring for diversity, they weren't matching that in terms of hiring for the appropriate skill for the job. So, and then weren't having the conversations in the developmental phase, weren't able to have the conversations through the growth phase that enabled people to develop. And so when they got to the performance review, what happened was that while it looked like all the boxes had been ticked, there was no one really investigating or growing that person who had been hired for diversity in the way that was needed. And what she noticed was that that actually increased the cultural bias in the organization because of that. And so the example there of, well, this person is not like the majority and this person also hasn't got the skills or the capabilities to do the job that we need. And so it's another good example of, in this case, from the other side, the people who were hired for diversity, what she also noticed, didn't trust that in this system that they would be treated with equity. And again, what was underneath this was the fear of having conversations beyond the box ticking. So systemic trust, going beyond in the value in this case of diversity, going beyond ticking boxes to actually understand each other, to understand what's at the center, what unites us, the mission of the organization, and to also then understand the diverse points of view that are coming in, and coming into the organization, and how they can be utilized in service of the mission.
Yeah, and the other, I think really present example when we're thinking about this is voting. So in the United States, we're thinking about systemic trust. Do we trust the voting systems of this country? Well, you're going to have arguments on both sides. In fact, I saw an article today that said, well, Trump would have lost in Texas if it weren't for one of the districts, and this was someone who ran the district voting, if we had allowed everyone to get their mail-in ballots. On the other side, of course, you have do we trust the mail-in ballots, and do we trust the electronic voting systems? Been big conversation in the United States. Probably not a new conversation in most, what I know in Latin American countries, voting has never been fully trusted. But I think it's a new question for the United States in terms of, do we actually trust the system that is counting our votes? Not only do we trust our neighbors to make the decision that we think is, aligned with ours, or that we have the same information, or we're on the same page about where this country is going, but do we trust the system itself that's counting those votes? And that's a fundamental pillar. So if you just think about this in terms of any system, and a political system, and an organization is a political system, by the way, every political system depends on systemic trust. Without that, it's very hard to cooperate. And it's not a good road to start walking down when we don't trust those systems, or those systems become, and by the way, it's about trust. It's also about trustworthiness, which is the responsibility of everyone who participates in the system. To be trustworthy enough. So big topic there to explore as well. The last one I think we wanted to talk about today was existential trust, right? We're not going to spend a ton of time here, because we could spend a ton of time here and go nowhere, because these are fundamental questions of faith and of cosmological belief and of hope. And how we cultivate these things is going to be different in different contexts and different cultures. But just thinking about the trust that there's going to be tomorrow, the trust that we are actually have the possibility of passing on what we create and also what we destroy to the next generations. And if I would say, in so many conversations we have, and so much of the doom scrolling that can happen on our iPhone or our devices, that existential trust that there's a purpose to our life here on earth, that there's a future, that there's a future that's worth living for humans on this planet, is also being eroded. And I think that we're choosing both to participate in the mechanisms that are feeding the stories, and we're participating in the consumption of those stories. I remember a conversation that we had with a friend of We Are Open Circles, and she was considering having a second child. And this is a person who I would think was generally kind of upbeat about life, and her purpose in life, many times she had said explicitly, but it was apparent in her actions, was about uplifting humanity. So I was a little surprised when she said, I'm just not sure. And I remember having this conversation while wildfire smoke was burning in California. It was flowing over us in California. And she said, I don't know we just don't know, because we're not sure that there's going to be a future for them. And then I contrast that with philosophies within Native cultures of thinking about our actions and how they're going to impact the next 7 generations, and that they're being influenced by 7 generations before us, and the difference of how we behave and the things that we invest our time in, and the choices that we make, and the relationships that we build when we believe that we're impacting 7 generations versus when we think that there may not be a place for the next generation. So again, it's about action and power, the power that we have to create hope in the world, and I'm not gonna discount that. But it's also about, what's the story that we want to believe in, and what's the story that we want to reinforce, because those two things are not mutually exclusive and they go hand in hand. If I don't believe that there's going to be a tomorrow for the next generation, why would I care about whether I put something in the recycling or the trash, to use a really simple example?
And the way that we work with this area primarily, and I think most effectively, is taking teams and leaders into the wilderness, and being able to see and highlight the movement of a day without distraction. The sun coming up, going to midday, going down. In our I don't know for many people, but for me, working in my office, I can often lose touch with that. I can often lose touch with the cycles of nature, the cycles of seasons. And part of taking people into the wilderness or semi-wilderness and removing distractions is actually to ground ourselves again in the cycles that are around us every day, all the time, that we all share, and the movement of life. And then looking at organizations, again, looking at the movement of an organization. So, beginning and actually being together, and seeing that and experiencing that together. Just a small way that can open this particular area of existential trust.
Yeah, I mean, if you've worked with us, you'll know we tend to portray, and we we definitely believe that any organization, any human individual, any human system is not a sort of linear. It's not a linear growth journey. It's a journey of cyclical growth and decay, growth, death, and decay, birth, growth, death, decay, and rebirth. And so you don't need an image of a circle to understand that, if you pay close attention to nature. Right? You don't need a new cosmology if you pay attention to nature. I was thinking about this a lot the other day. I was in the redwood forest, which is a great example of death and renewal, birth, death, and renewal. You have thousands years old trees that are hundreds of feet tall. You have those trees that have, some of them recently fallen down, just a natural cycle. Some that have been laying down on the forest floor for probably decades and have a whole ecosystem, a diverse ecosystem growing out of the fallen tree, with other trees of other species growing, fungus, lichen, moss, but shrubs, just a whole life ecosystem, plus the animals. And if we ever get caught up in the belief that we can so easily, because our culture tends to be death averse, and we tend to think of ourselves as going like beginning to end, and then what happens after that's up to a great leap of faith that I think many people are not making anymore. Just to know that our bodies, the material of the earth is going to be renewed just like that, like those trees, can be a sort of form of consolation. And if you don't even want to go there, we can just think about our organizations and our work and our careers, also having that cycle. So even though we will one day, retire and die, we can leave, we'll probably be leaving marks on people's lives and in next generations of lives that we will never know and understand. And that can kind of pull us back from some of the dismay we may feel at the news cycle, or the ups and downs of our businesses, or the falling apart of relationships, because there is everywhere around us renewal happening.
Yeah. So if you have seen on our website or through working with us the process that we use, the first step is trust, building trust in a team or an organization. And that building of trust is about letting the complexity of who people are, of what is going on in the environment, into the team environment, into the team environment. It's very much moving from a line of sight that's linear. We're going to do these things and that's going towards this one thing, and actually feeling, seeing, experiencing together the complexity in the environment and those cycles. And so that building of trust is, yes, about psychological safety, the ability to share the complexity of our stories, of our experiences in the organization. And yes, it's also together being able to let that complexity, those stories, the environment move us in those cycles.
Yeah, so just to recap, when you're thinking about trust, when it comes to individuals or teams, the trust that, trustworthiness that needs to be built, and the trust that we need to cultivate or identify as not being there and address is trust and integrity, that we are who we say we are. The trust in capability, that we can do what we say we're going to do, and the trust in follow through, that we will do what we say we're going to do, or we're going to have a conversation about why not. And those three things can happen in succession, but they also feed into each other. And then the bigger, squishier ones that we're always trying to be aware of here is systemic trust. So, you might have the integrity of you might have people with integrity and individuals that are capable and individuals that follow through. But if the system that is holding them together is not trustworthy or not trusted, you're going to have that breakdown in trust among the people. And lastly, just, being attuned and aware when it comes to burnout, when it comes to mental health challenges on teams and in communities, that building the trust that there is a purpose here, that yes, there are changes, and yes, some of those changes can feel like a death or are death, but that there is renewal happening around us all the time, and that we need to cultivate a relationship with the world and with ourselves, that we have responsibility to cultivate a relationship with ourselves and the world, to be clear, that creates hope even amongst the challenges, and doesn't allow us that we don't allow ourselves to fall into despair because we don't trust that there's going to be a tomorrow for the next generation, or for the team, or for the people that we're working with. I hope this was useful. We hope this was useful. Please, reach out to us if you have if we've said anything that you think is completely wrong, or you love what we said, either way, or anything in between. Let us know. It's a conversation that we're having. You can join us on Circle Labs, where these conversations are happening all the time, and oftentimes centered around books that are related to the topics that we're talking about here, just to keep the conversation alive, and let us think a little bit more deeply about what we're considering and what we're doing, and how we're leading, or how we're participating on teams or in communities. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.